able to yet. I'll stick around for a little bit after the presentation if you'd like to come up with any questions that you might not have, we might not have gotten to during this presentation. This one's going to be a little bit different, and shame on me for not making a Halloween-themed PowerPoint presentation because this subject matter is a little bit scary. It's a lot of tricks, not so many treats. I believe it was last year, I was here with one of the Bliss McKnight staffers, and we talked about First Amendment auditors, which we're going to talk about a lot today again, and what has changed or evolved over the last year. But I do want to give a little bit of a foundation for the open door law first, because it's always good, and I'm always getting questions from auditors and commissioners and council people about this subject, so it's always good to have a refresher. It's good for me too. But the way I like to do my presentations and my trainings, if you've joined me before, is to have a dialogue or a discussion. So please don't hesitate to interrupt. Raise your hand. I'll try to catch you in the crowd there. If you have any specific questions, nothing's off limits. It's a safe space here. So we can talk about whatever generalities or specifics that you'd like. I'd love to hear with what you're dealing with in your county when it comes to public access and government transparency and all of that. Now, I'm not sure if my PowerPoint is in your materials, but if not, let me know. I can get it to you. We're not going to hit on everything today. Fortunately, the powers that be have only scheduled me for an hour. A couple weeks ago, I went to a small community in southern Indiana, and they asked me to speak for 3 hours. So you're spared from that for your own good. But like I said, there's always a standing invitation to reach out to my office. I will fast forward to the slide at the end just in case you don't have it. That'll have all my contact information on it. And please, 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 anytime you want to reach out, I would be happy to talk. My official title is Public Access Counselor, but from time to time, when I'm talking to my colleagues who are public officials and public employees, sometimes I think it might be more aptly named Public Access Therapist. And that's okay, because it lets off some steam for me to talk to you guys about this stuff as well, because it can be frustrating. It can be inconvenient. It can be a little bit cumbersome at times to navigate all of this. And I know that auditors in and of themselves don't sit on governing bodies in the same way as if I was talking to commissioners or council people, but you're integrated in that world, especially when it comes to your role as secretaries of those types of boards. And so having a working knowledge of all of this is a good idea, but we're not going to hit so much on that. I'll just give you a brief overview as to talk about, like I mentioned, some of the pitfalls that I'm seeing statewide and nationwide when it comes to people who might abuse some of these concepts for personal or financial gain. But before we get to the sour stuff, let's talk about some of the good stuff. And if you'll indulge me here, I do this at every single one of my presentations, and I talk about this slide. And I would encourage you, as we read through these words, to use this as a jumping off point. And to know that I realize that doing this, that adhering to this, and to remain in compliance with a lot of these statutes and rules and regulations do have built-in inefficiencies. We live in a world today where folks like to say, as efficient as possible and run it like a business. Well, I would pose to you that government is not a business. And we do not sell widgets. We do not have clients. We have constituents. And we serve our communities. We're not selling them a bill of goods, but we're serving them. Now, we can do so in a business-like fashion, and I will always encourage that, but it is different. And so some of these built-in inconveniences and inefficiencies can sometimes cause some tension, especially from folks who come from the private sector. And I came from the private sector into government as well, and it was a bit of a culture shock. Wait a minute, why can't we cut corners for the sake of efficiency? Why can't we take the path of least resistance if it's going to get our job done? But it's not so much about that. It's about serving the people that are entrusting us with their resources. So let's take a look here at what the General Assembly instructs us in how we approach our duties as public officials. It says, a fundamental philosophy of the American constitutional form of government is that government is the servant of the people and not its master. Accordingly, it is the public policy of those who, of the state, that all persons are entitled to full and complete information regarding the affairs of the government and the official of the acts of those who represent them as employees and officials. Now, why is that important? Well, I alluded it to it a minute ago, but I always say this. At every presentation I have, I always make clear that when we're drawing our salary from local government, or in my case, from the state, when we use tax dollars for our programming, when we spend it on contracts and vendors and programs for the betterment of our communities, that all of that money came from someone who earned it and turned it over to us, that trusts us with that information. So everything we're going to talk about today is how do we show that we are accountable to them who entrusted us with those resources? How do we show that we are the best person for the job? Now, if I'm talking to groups that, like yourselves, that are elected into office, what better way to demonstrate to your potential voters that they made the right choice and that they voted for the right person than by showing ourselves as examples of accountability? I use this analogy sometimes when I speak, and I say, government transparency and public access is a little bit like a math proof. When we were going through elementary and grade school, at some point in the process, we stopped getting to just come to the conclusion in our heads and writing down the answer. We had to somehow show our work and demonstrate to the teacher that we knew what we were doing and that we were taking the steps not only to get to the right answer, but that our methodology was sound as well. And it's not so much different with this stuff either. When we are holding open meetings, when we are making our records available, that, in a sense, is what we're doing. We are demonstrating that we're being thoughtful and mindful with the work that goes into making sound decisions. And I'll tell you this right off the bat. You are not going to get buy-in from everyone on your ultimate decision. It's just not going to happen. It's the nature of the communities, the society we live in. We're not going to please everyone all the time. But don't let them attack the way you got there and the mindfulness and thoughtfulness that goes into making these kinds of decisions, because that's what this stuff is all about. So I won't bore you with the little time we have today. I won't bore you with the ins and outs of my office. If you're unfamiliar with what I do, you can look that up online on our website. Just know that we do have a website, and if you do miss my contact information up here later on, that I'm pretty easy to track down. And the website that we have has all that contact information, as well as frequently asked questions, tips, tricks, how to apply all this in real life scenarios. We also have a catalog of legal advisory opinions that I've written over the years, as well as my predecessors. They go back to 1999. So chances are, if you're finding yourself in a space where you might not know exactly what to do in a particular situation, there's a good chance it's already been addressed by my office, and you can do a search through that library of advisory opinions to find what you need. That's especially so if you can't track me down. So just to let you know, I am the smallest public agency in the executive state branch or state executive branch of government. It's just me. So when you call, most likely, I'm going to pick up the phone, but if not, I have, as part of my kind of internal metrics, to make sure that I return phone calls within at least 48 hours, but my goal is 24 hours if you can't get me in real time. So either way, you're going to find the answer you need, and please don't be shy about reaching out. So we're going to skip through my powers and duties here and get to one critical slide. And by the end of this slide, we're all going to be about 95% of the way there to understanding what the open door law means. And then we're going to jump off from there and talk about some of those other types of sticky situations we might get ourselves into when it comes to dealing with a certain segment of our population that's unfortunately growing. And you'll see what I mean when we get there. So there are 6 bullet points on this slide. We're going to go through each of them carefully, and hopefully that will invite some questions. But when you are dealing with your council, when you are dealing with your commissioners, these are the things to keep in mind. These are the basics. It's the rule of thumb of the open door law. So like I said, there's 6 bullet points. The first 4 are what I call the ingredients to the recipe of a public meeting. If you have all of these elements in place, you have a public meeting. And the other 2, 5 and 6, are going to be how to keep that meeting legal, how to remain in compliance with the open door law. Now, some of these responsibilities, like notice, may fall on your office. It just depends. It's a case-by-case type or a county-by-county type thing. Some commissioners, county members will outsource certain things to their auditor, and some don't. Some keep it more in-house. But we'll talk about all of that and what it looks like. So let's talk about these first 4 right off the bat. Again, this is the ingredient to the meal of a public meeting. Anytime a majority of a governing body takes official action on public business, if all of these 4 things are in place, you have a public meeting. Let's talk about these. A majority. That's seemingly the easiest one. It's a numerical majority. 2 out of 3 commissioners. 4 out of 7 council members. Some of you have 9, 5 out of 9. It is more than 50%. That is the foundation. You have to have those numbers in place. Where it gets a little tricky, and we're not going to get into the weeds about this today unless there's questions, but what happens with remote participation, the new rules around that, who has to be present, who can call in over a Zoom platform or WebEx or whatever. But if there's a meeting of the minds, if there's simultaneous presence, whether virtual or physical, of a numerical majority, that's our first step. And number 2 gets even squishier. And that's what is a governing body. Well, I mentioned a few, your county boards, but also BZAs, PDBOAs, Redevelopment Commission, Plan Commission, all of those can qualify as governing bodies and do qualify as governing bodies as well. And what is more is some of those committees or offshoots of those boards can qualify as well. If the county council, for example, has a personnel committee to review kind of in a vacuum the salary matrix and then present recommendations to the full council. There are situations where, if designated as such, that minority committees, so 3 out of 7, for example, could constitute a whole new governing body. So you go through this analysis again, and then it might be 2 out of 3 as opposed to 4 out of 7. So it gets a little weird as far as what's a governing body, what is not. The legislature tweaked this slightly this past session and to kind of loosen the rules a little bit as to what a committee might look like. But just know, if there's a question about, is this a governing body? Isn't it? Is this a public meeting? Isn't it? Always err on the side of caution and have it be a public meeting. Or reach out to me and we can talk through it, and I can counsel you accordingly. Hey, no big deal here. Not a public meeting. You don't have to post notice. Don't have to do any of this stuff. But the presumption is that if there's a question, yes or no, and there's a kind of a 50-50 judgment call, err on the side of it being a public meeting, err on the side of it qualifying as a governing body. Now, this third prong isn't so much squishy as it is confusing to folks, especially those who are new to government. Official action. What is official action? Well, just as a layman looking at this term, you might think, well, official action are those official decisions. There are those votes that go into, decision making. I vote yes on the budget. I vote no on the zoning ordinance. Official action, right? Well, no, that's actually considered a different legal term of art called final action. Official action is everything that goes into final action, everything that leads up to that decision, everything that goes into that vote, deliberating, discussing, receiving information. That's a passive thing, but it still qualifies under the legal definition of official action. And all this goes back to what I was saying earlier about showing our work, being transparent, showing every step in the process of the decision. So anytime official action takes place, if you're as a collective, as a majority of a governing body, if you're just receiving information, it's enough. And we'll talk about exceptions briefly as well, but just stick with me. This is the basic rule of thumb again. So this is the rule and not the exception. But then once you get to that final prong, it has to be about public business. Now, I realize that some of you might live in small communities, and 2 out of 3 of your commissioners might go to the same high school football game on Friday night. They might worship in the same church congregation. They might run into each other at the market. Does that mean that they can't exchange pleasantries and talk about their families, talk about the Pacers, talk about whatever? No, they're allowed to do that, 100%. They can go to the local diner and have a meal together. And as long as public business is not approached, they're good to go. They're fine. The open door law does not regulate everything. I got a little frustrated last spring during some of the discussions that the General Assembly was having, saying that the open door law is too strict. And they were trying to say that, it says anytime 2 people get together for a cup of coffee that they have to post notice. Absolutely not. That is not the case. That is not the case at all. This regulates what they do in their capacity as commissioners, council people, BZA members, PETA bond members, what have you. It does not regulate their entire life. But what I do caution about from time to time, and feel free to go back and spread this to your colleagues, is that there can be a perception sometimes of that. If the commissioners meet before every commissioner meeting at the diner an hour before, and then they go into the commissioners meeting, have a perfunctory meeting, they're voting yes or no, but don't really have any discussion before the vote. What kind of perception does that give? It may be completely on the up and up, I don't know. But it certainly might send a signal or raise a red flag to audience members that maybe they've talked about all of this before and now they're just voting. But maybe not. So when I'm talking to those actual governing body members, I'm always telling them, just be mindful of perception. Be careful. You do not have to act like polar opposite magnets every time you're in the same room together. You don't have to retreat to your respective corners. Just make sure that you're not talking about public business if you're in a conversation as a majority of a governing body. Okay? All right. So, public meeting. This is your definition. Any questions about this so far? Yes, in the back, we've got one here. You're going to break the ice here.
My question is, if we have a commissioners meeting or a council meeting, and then you turn the recording off and the meeting's over, and the commissioners or council continue to sit there for 30, 40, however long, and continue discussing business, and no votes are taken, just discussing, is there anything, what's the status of that? Because I've had tons of people come to me as the auditor and saying, the meeting, you shouldn't be turning their live stream off until the meeting's completely done, because they're having meetings after the meetings. So yes.
So this is a pretty common situation. You know, we're all human. We're all kind of, if we're at the dais, I sit on governing bodies as well, so I have to practice what I preach also. But, you know, when that gavel pounds or however you adjourn the meeting, you know, at that point, this public business is done, especially as a majority. Now, if the council meeting adjourns and 2 of the 7 stick around afterwards and they're not part of an official committee and they're talking about public business, that's fine. That's okay. But if you have that majority right there and they're still sticking around talking, it's no problem if they're talking about their families or sports or church or whatever. But again, the perception piece. But they shouldn't be talking about public business once that meeting adjourns.
How would you advise the auditors then to handle that?
Well, part of that's my job, is to get the word out to commissioners or council people that, you know, watch what you do. And so in the same way I'm speaking to you here today, I also go and talk to the Commissioners Association, the County Association, and the Council People's Association as well. So they're on the honor system to a degree, but as an auditor, you know, a gentle reminder, if you're comfortable doing so, is fine. Ultimately, the responsibility is on them to mind all of this. But, you know, I do know auditors who are perfectly comfortable with saying, hey, you know, watch what you're doing here, guys. But that is certainly not a requirement and is not an expectation on my part either. You do what you're comfortable with. Okay, so we got the definition here. Now, what are the other 2? I mentioned there were 6 bullet points on this slide. What do we have to do to keep the public meeting legal? 2 things. We have to give 48 hours notice of that meeting, and it has to be open to the public. And here's where the fun stuff starts coming in. Not so much with the notice, but definitely with the openness. Okay, let's talk about notice real quick. Pretty simple. Date, time, and location posted at the meeting location itself or the principal place of business for that governing body. If the commissioner's chambers are in the courthouse, you post it in a conspicuous location in the courthouse. Could be in the lobby. At the state, for example, we have a conference center and we have these LED monitors that list all of the meetings for the day right there, and they've been up 48 hours in advance. That's good enough. It doesn't have to be on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, or it doesn't have to take any form or format other than announcing 48 hours in advance when and where you're meeting, date, time, and location. This is for a regular meeting. There are certain rules around hearings. You know, we're in budget season now, and I defer to Commissioner Shackle about a lot of those procedures, but I do know that there are heightened requirements for public hearings prior to a budget adoption. There are certain requirements for special meetings of commissioners, for example. So there are one-off exceptions that need to be addressed from time to time, but what we're talking about today is just your basic routine public meeting. Now you may say, well, Luke, we post we post in January all of our meeting schedule throughout the year. We meet on the first Tuesday of the month at 7:00 in the commissioners' chambers. If you're posting that at the beginning of the year and that stays up at the beginning of the year and there's no deviation from that one singular annual meeting itinerary is fine. You're good. You don't have to post individual 48-hour notice each and every time. If there's a deviation, though, and with commissioners, that's called a special meeting. But if there's a deviation, you have to post that at least 48 hours in advance individually. There are also some situations where the media may ask you for individualized notice. And if they do so prior to the beginning of the year, they are entitled to that individualized notice. They're the only ones. Citizen Jones can't come and ask you, but Reporter Jones can. And you would have to send them an email or a fax and say, hey, heads up, we're having a meeting if there's a deviation from your annualized notice. Again, this should be in a conspicuous location in your place of business. Shouldn't be in the darkened, cobweb-filled hallway on the 4th floor of the courthouse where no one dares to tread. It should be in the lobby. It should be in a thoroughfare, a placard out in front, however you do it. I've seen those scrolling LCD readouts in front of the fire station. That's fine too. As long as it has the information, as long as it's conspicuous, you're going to be good to go. But this next point, yeah, we have a question here.
The year, how you said you could just do it one time and it hold up for the year. Are you talking about just the papers that get hung up around the building, or do you mean the newspaper publication as well?
Okay. So what we were talking about today is just the regular meeting notices. Like I mentioned, certain things like special types of hearings, annexation, zoning ordinances, things like that, that require published notice. That's different. That's in another arena. We can talk about that offline if you want. But today we're just talking about those routine meetings where you're posting it at the building. You're not publishing them in the newspaper. You don't have to publish regular routine meetings in the newspaper. That's kind of a common misconception as well.
Even when it's considered a hearing rather than a meeting?
If it's a hearing, that's one of those outliers. That's a different situation that might be published. That actually trumps this stuff. If there's another method of publication required by statute, that trumps this kind of notice.
And I had called your office once to ask this question. A hearing, if you are appropriating money at a council meeting, that is considered a hearing rather than a meeting. Is that correct? But if it's just transfers, that could be just a meeting. That's
the kind of thing I defer to DLGF on what they require, because that's a separate procedure. The open door law doesn't cover hearings at all, actually. And my office kind of takes its cues from other public agencies that have more of subject matter knowledge over those procedures. So,
okay.
I know enough to be dangerous, but I don't answer them up here from the pulpit. Any other questions about that notice stuff? Okay. So this final point, this final requirement to make it legal, dovetails nicely into the latter portion of our conversation this afternoon. Must be open to the public. What does that mean? Well, that has evolved a little bit over the past 5 years because we had this terrible event called COVID, and it kind of changed the way governing bodies can do business. prior to March of 2020, a meeting was, you have it in a physical location. There's a dais or a table up here. The board is sitting behind it. The audience is in the audience. And the audience gets to observe, and they get to conspicuously record that meeting. And that's kind of where it stops and starts. Well, in March 2020, when COVID hit, we had this pandemic on our hands, and the powers that be deemed it unsafe to meet in that kind of manner. So they tweaked that the governor actually issued an executive order in March of 2020 that said, this executive order overrides the open door law, and it's going to give governing bodies the ability to meet virtually. And that remained in place for a couple of years, as you know. And it would be triggered again. It's been codified now. So it would be triggered again if there was another disaster emergency declared. But since right now there's not, fortunately, we are back to in-person attendance. And what changed through the law is that now the legislature kind of loosened up the rules around remote participation for the members of the governing body. There's now an opportunity, a limited opportunity, for them to remotely participate virtually. And there's a whole set of guidelines around this. There's a lot of rules around what they can and can't do, what kind of conversations they can be a part of, prohibitions on the types of things they can vote on, but it does give them a limited opportunity to participate remotely. What it doesn't do, however, is kind of open it up to having all virtual meetings or telling the public you can only attend over Zoom. There has to be a physical location for people to come and observe. Now, I kind of paused to let that sink in a minute, because the next thing I'm going to tell you is that the rules are changing even more. So in July 2025, if everything holds true through the next legislative session, which of course with everything, it's subject to change, but as it stands right now, as of July 2025, governing bodies who qualify under the statute have to either live stream their meetings, or if the broadband isn't available to live stream, then to record those meetings and subsequently upload those to a website or a social media platform after the fact and have those up there for 90 days. Now, who qualifies for that? Here's where more confusion comes in. What I can tell you is that definitely, absolutely, county boards of commissioners and county councils must live stream their meetings or record them and upload them July 2025. Now, here's where it gets a little wonky. Any other board that meets in the same chambers as one of those two has to record or live stream as well. That could be a county election board, that could be a BZA, that could be a PETA. Independently, if they met in another conference room or they met in another location, they wouldn't have to. But by virtue of being in that same physical space, presumably because everything's kind of set up already, that they would be obligated to live stream that as well. So you could have a situation where in January, the Plan Commission meets in one room and has to live stream, but then in February they meet in a different room and they don't. So the statute isn't always the most practical in application, but what is, you know? So just be mindful that those rules are in place, of course, subject to change, but hopefully my office can help you navigate that as the time comes closer to implementation. Now, let's talk about participation at meetings. Participation on the part of the public. And this is what's going to lead us to our next conversation. Despite what some folks think, there is no absolute right to speak at a public meeting in Indiana unless specific outlying situations apply. At your regular council meetings, at your regular commissioner meetings, a public comment forum is a courtesy extended to attendees. I encourage that discretion to be exercised in favor of that public comment forum, but it is not an absolute requirement. Now, I mentioned before, things like public hearings, other one-off type situations might. Other types of governing bodies, for example, for whatever reason, school boards and township advisory boards, they have to allow public comment at each and every one of their meetings. But no type of board at the county level does. It's completely optional. And if you do allow that, or if your boards do, I encourage it. I think it's good. People need to be able to give input to their representative officials. That's a healthy thing. But again, we live in a society that discourse sometimes is not always civil. And hopefully you don't live in one of those communities, and we'll talk here about some horror stories, but just in time for Halloween. But I would encourage you to have sound policies regarding that public comment forum. So, okay, for example, commissioners give 30 minutes at every meeting that anyone who signs up to speak gets 3 minutes of individual time to talk. And so long as they are somewhat professional and civil, they can say whatever they want regarding the affairs of the county. Do they get to go off on some wild tangent about the federal government that has nothing to do with county? No, you can say, hey, let's keep this to county business. Do they get to go back 10 years and complain about what happened, in 2014 with the bridge project that the current commissioners had nothing to do with and isn't ripe for reconsideration? No, they don't get to do that either necessarily. But do they get to talk about, hey, I disagree with how you're approaching this expenditure, or I agree with what you're doing in regard to this project. My point being is that you can't have viewpoint discrimination. You can't favor the people who support rather than oppose. Now, I'm not telling tales out of school. Every single one of you is probably very familiar with projects like solar and wind and the kind of outcry that can invite from the community, one way or the other, in support or opposition, and I'm completely neutral on that. But that invites a lot of discourse, and sometimes a lot of agitated discourse. So what I tell folks is have those policies in place. Run it through your county attorney. Run it through my office. Make sure that it's going to meet not only open door law muster, but also First Amendment considerations as well, that any restrictions you place on those is going to be viewed through the lens of an appropriate time, place, and manner type restrictions. Because in those four walls of that meeting room, the board is in control. They just can't do anything that favors one viewpoint over another. And it's important as well to have a strong presiding officer that makes sure some of those protocols and policies are met. Okay. Any question about comment before I move on? Or participation or anything else? All right. So let's take the remaining time and I'll scare you here. So show of hands. You didn't know you were going to participate, but you're going to have to. Show of hands. How many people are familiar with the sovereign citizen movement? A good portion of you. How many are familiar with First Amendment auditors? Okay, a few less, but still a good portion. How about and this is new, Second Amendment auditors. Not as many. Okay, let me explain each one. I call them, you might have heard me use this term if you've been in these sessions in the past, I call them crypto ideologies, where they take existing law, this law included, and they combine it with their version of constitutional provisions, civil rights, First Amendment, Sixth Amendment, Fourth Amendment stuff, and they kind of combine it all into this witch's brew of nonsense, and they use it to their own means. Now, I'm trying not to be pejorative toward these folks. I talk to these folks almost every day. I had a conversation with one in my hotel room last night, and they're not all terribly ill-intentioned, but a lot of them are. Some of them have been kind of duped into this way of thinking, and I've yet to speak to one that have probably gotten higher than an average grade in their 7th grade civics class. But some of them just want to be engaged civically. And in that regard, it's not a bad thing. We want more people engaged. We just want them engaged the right way. And so everything we've been talking about up to this point about showing our work is kind of important in educating our community as well. Because especially during like COVID, where people were really riled up about public health and safety measures, and in the school board, some curricular issues, people just didn't know how to approach the government. So they went about it the wrong way. They'd never engaged before. I grew up in a time, I don't think my parents ever went to a school board meeting. I don't think they ever went to a community meeting at all of their local government. And a lot of people are like that. They just don't show up. So good for them for at least trying to show up. We just need to figure out how to communicate to them how to do it the right way. And as I talk to these folks too, I need to be part of that process as well. So anyway, let me back up. Sovereign citizens. What are they? This is probably the worst of the lot, believe it or not. They just do not believe the rules apply to them. They're using stuff like admiralty law to come up with why they can do whatever they want. They don't, the police that pull them over don't have any jurisdiction over them. Usually it's some weird thing where they think the county sheriff is the only one that has any law enforcement jurisdiction at all. So they thumb their nose at municipal PD, they thumb their nose at local ordinances, and the sheriff is the only true constitutional officer that is worth anything. Federal government doesn't exist. They have some very, very strange ideas about democracy and the government. I won't go into them all. It's weird. It is. I have seen less and less of them be as much of an issue in the public records world lately, but they used to do things like they would ask for all of the county officers' oaths and bonds, and then file against those bonds and try to say that the office is vacant, therefore I don't have to pay my taxes and everything else. It's very strange. But I've seen less and less of that. It's been replaced with these First Amendment auditors. So I was out last week at the University of Nevada. I was taking a class with a bunch of other judges. I'm not a judge myself, but I'm in a decision-making role, so it was worthwhile to be there. And I kind of said, hey, how do you, and we were in a course about judges that kind of blow their top, in the courtroom. And I said, well, how do you handle sovereign citizens, First Amendment auditors, whatever, that come in and try to disrupt and agitate and slow down or even stop proceedings from happening? And each one was familiar with all this, and they all had a different take on how to handle it. And we'll talk about some mitigation skills as well, but we're all trying to figure all of this out at once, and there's no right answer. But what First Amendment auditors will do, and this is a little scary for your staff especially, is they will come in to a courthouse or a town hall, And they will find and they'll seek out vulnerable areas of the physical building itself. And they almost always have either a GoPro or they'll have a camera, even like an over-the-shoulder camera, and they'll film everything. And what they want to do is they want to find those vulnerabilities, especially someone who may appear to be vulnerable on your staff, and harass them to the degree that then they will get a reaction from that person. And when that happens, that's gold to them, because they get to upload that online to YouTube. And some of these folks, I've read that they make hundreds of thousands a month with these views. So what they're doing is they're using their own suspect behavior to invoke bad behavior on the part of government officials and then monetize it. So, and kind of the reason why I'm talking to you today about this is if you haven't encountered it, great. I hope you never do. But if you do, just be aware that there are ways to keep your building and your staff safe and free from harassment. And we'll talk about those here in a second. But I also wanted to mention this final category, which not many hands raised, and I'm glad they haven't. But this is, as you can imagine, it's going to be more and more dangerous as we go forward. And again, I'm neutral on this stuff professionally, so don't read into this at all. But we live in a culture that values firearms and guns. And you can have your own take about that. I get to have my own take about it. I don't get to do here, though. But what these Second Amendment auditors will do is they'll say, okay, in Indiana, for example, we have permitless carry now. Some folks call it constitutional carry. And so what they will do is they'll go into public spaces, the state building or a courthouse or a town hall, and they will test the boundaries of, can I carry here? And as you can imagine, that could lead to some potentially dangerous interactions. And I hope that this doesn't take off much. I mean, it is perfectly constitutional to say no guns in the courthouse, no guns in the state building where I work, unless you're authorized to do so by law. You know, sheriffs can, sheriff's deputies can, police officers can, certain personnel at the state can as well. But average member of the public who's going in for a traffic court hearing in front of a judge doesn't necessarily get to. Someone who walks into a school board meeting doesn't necessarily get to bring their firearm into the school building for various different safety reasons. But these Second Amendment auditors are now starting to test those boundaries. You guys seen the movie Jurassic Park, a few 30 years old or so? And part of it was, the raptors would jump against the fence to see how electrified they are and test those fence boundaries. The same kind of concept. They're seeing how far they can go. And the First Amendment stuff, especially, as that's kind of taken off. I mean, I've seen situations where they are literally filming over someone's shoulder at their workstation while someone's working on very sensitive material. They walked into a health department and a nurse was uploading vaccine information that's confidential. If there aren't boundaries in place to prevent it, that person could capture all of that information and upload it online. So if you were here last year, you'll remember that our number one recommendation was signage. No personnel, no one but authorized personnel beyond this point. Or especially with judges, they'll have no recording in the courtroom. Or authorized personnel only beyond this door, or stanchions, that prevent people from going where they're not supposed to. One of the boundaries that a lot of these First Amendment auditors do recognize is signage. They know that if they go past a point they're not supposed to, that they run the risk of getting a disorderly conduct charge. So they kind of know their limits to a degree, but they'll still try to push. So robust signage in your physical space is important. Also, coach your employees that, to be on the lookout and to make sure that they don't leave sensitive documentation out on their workplaces where someone can, even from the front desk, zoom in on something and capture it. Locked doors. Unfortunately, I don't have staff in my office anymore. And so I'm in a space kind of sequestered from the rest of the building. And don't tell the Department of Administration this, but I have about 3,000 square foot of space to myself back there. And it's great sometimes. But even when I was working with a couple of other staffers, it got a little eerie when someone would just walk back there, especially with a camera, uninvited, and just walk into our offices. And we had an issue earlier this year where we had to put in those card readers where they could only get back with a badge. If you have that capability, if you have those resources in your community, in your physical space, you might want to think about something like that as well. And there's nothing wrong with that. The law does say that anyone can film a public employee doing their job in a common space, in a public lobby, for example. Cameras are allowed there. So building-wide cell phone bans probably aren't gonna pass muster because of that law. But individual spaces, courtrooms, administrative offices, places where the public in general does not get to see, that'll stand more likely than not. The other thing is a little more difficult to qualify and quantify, and it's how to actually address these folks. And it is sometimes prohibitively difficult to do so, because what did I say? They're trying to push you. They're trying to elicit a reaction. And this is against my better nature, because I don't have this kind of personality necessarily. I'm a lawyer. I like to be argumentative. I like to be combative. But I also have to step back and say, I got to pick my battles. And is this worth trying to win an argument? So when I interact with some of these folks, when I was in my hotel room last night talking on the phone to them, I just kind of let them talk, and kind of wear themselves out. And they will. They'll run out of material. But, being cloyingly over the top polite is sometimes the best way to combat all of this. And that's tough when we know we're right, when we don't know, I'm talking about body cams last night. I said, no, you cannot walk into a police office and demand that you see all of an officer's body cam footage for his entire shift on demand. That was the theme of that conversation. I laid down that ground rule. I said, you can't do that. And then I had to listen to a half hour of him talking about why he thought he could because he was a First Amendment auditor. And I just let him go. And at the end, I said, well, thank you. You've given me a lot to think about. I appreciate your perspective. And we hung up amicably. And sometimes that is the best remedy. Somebody's going to come into your offices and they're going to be hot, and they're going to take that, distrust of the government that I think everybody has to some degree inherently, but it's amplified. Maybe they got a traffic ticket, maybe they got an arrest, and they didn't think they should, and so they're going to bring it down on the heads of some poor administrative assistant that's just trying to do his job at the front desk. So it's imperative that you let your staff know that this is a possibility, but to treat it with the same customer service principles as you would anyone else, even if they're wrong. Don't let them get their way. They don't get things they shouldn't get just because they're amplified and angry, but to treat them with respect. One of the judges that I was with last week that I asked, how do you deal with sovereign citizens who just show up to the courtroom and spout absolute nonsense? And he said, I had a situation one time where it was a traffic ticket. It was like a low-level infraction type deal. And sovereign citizen came in and gave this half-hour-long oration about how he was entitled to travel because he had the constitutional right to do so, and no one could impede his travel. He said, I gave him 15 minutes to wear himself out, and then I just said, I appreciate your point of view, but those aren't the rules we play by here in the United States. That's all he said. And he said after the ticket was upheld and after everything kind of calmed down, that sovereign citizen addressed the judge and said, I disagree with you, but no one's ever given me that kind of respect before, and I appreciate that, and I respect you now as a result. Now, that is a very naive, Pollyannish way of expecting that to happen every single interaction. But I will say that in my experience, treating people with respect and kindness, even when they're wrong, even when it's so antithetical to what I stand for as a public official, if I just listen, nod, and are polite to them, that goes a long, long way, no matter how much I want to argue back. So again, leaving you on a sour note, as sometimes I have before, but I just want to ask if there's any questions about any of this stuff, any open door law stuff. We didn't talk about public records. It's all in your material. Love to talk to you about that online, but we do have one question up here. Yeah.
I'm coming.
In the meantime, I'm going to fast forward to my contact info here.
I have a gentleman who I've dealt with for many, many years, and I don't know what he's got going on. Anyway, he keeps coming in and asking me about a level 3 auditor. Have you heard of that?
3 auditor. That sounds kind of like a Scientology thing. I've heard it in that context, but not with the First Amendment or Second Amendment audit stuff. I mean, a Third Amendment auditor, I guess, would make sure we're not quartering British soldiers, but I don't think we're gonna get to that point.
He's using it. He's using level 3 auditor, telling me that I need to contact a level 3 auditor to get out of paying his property taxes over an issue that happened 20 years ago with his family. So I'm really not sure what he's getting at, but I was just curious if anybody else had heard of level 3.
Anybody else heard of that? I haven't. It sounds kind of like a sovereign citizen thing, because a lot of what they do has to do with how they're not subject to taxation.
Okay, I have a question. This refers to executive sessions. Mm-hmm. I've had a spirited conversation with my county attorney regarding that I cannot be at a commissioners only executive session. I believe I heard you say I have to be there. Am I correct?
Yes, I have published material in the past that said that an auditor, county auditor, or their designee needs to be at all proceedings of commissioners and council, including executive sessions, for a couple reasons. Number one, because there is that honor system on the part of that governing body. You're there as a check and balance against that. And secondly, if you're going to be the record keeper of that or secretary of that board, then you need to be present to accurately keep documentation of those proceedings. Executive sessions, of course, as you probably know, are the exception to the rule in very, very limited circumstances.
Go ahead. Okay, so our county is one of those counties that the commissioners have their own secretary. I know by statute, the auditor is the secretary. I haven't designated that person to be the secretary. They apparently have. I've kind of inherited that situation. She is at all the meetings. She takes all the minutes, and I attend as well, but then she comes to me and wants me to attest. Am I attesting to their signature? Am I attesting to the accuracy of the minutes? Should I still be invited to executive sessions? How does all of that unfold when they have their own secretary?
So unless an extraordinary circumstance applies, you as auditor get to choose who your designee is to be the secretary of those proceedings. And so if I was in your role, I would be hesitant to attest to anything I didn't individually witness. The only attestation that's required in an executive session is that the only thing discussed was what was on the notice. And for executive sessions, for those of you who don't know, have to give the subject matter in the notice as well as date, time, and location. Usually that's going to be done by a presiding officer or an auditor or an attorney who is in the room. It doesn't really matter. But I would suggest that if you're going to sign your name to something, kind of like a notary, you be the one to witness it.
So if I'm present at the meeting and I can verify that it happened according to the minutes, then I can sign those.
Yeah.
But if I'm absent, should she attest them?
A designee, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
well, I
fine.
guess.
That's-
Do I have to designate her every single meeting, or is that an understood
It can
situation?
be an informal, understood arrangement.
Okay.
That's fine.
I have a question on emails and text messages. So at our council meetings, a lot of time the president will say, when he presents something, I've texted you guys this information before the meeting. Can he do that?
Yeah, that's okay. Disseminating information online isn't a problem so long as it doesn't turn into kind of a call and response, back and forth conversation outside of a meeting. But just generally disseminating information over email or text is okay. It's just it shouldn't rise to the level of a conversation.
So if they send a recommendation by email, like I received today to all the council members, from one council member to all of them, can they do that if it's a recommendation?
I would be very wary of that type of thing, of anyone saying, hey, I'm going to vote this way, or I'm going to approve this, or I make this recommendation. They should probably be doing that in an open meeting.
Hey, Luke.
Commissioner?
I'd just like to say thank you for your presentation. It's great as always. And I've worked with Luke for a number of years and have relied on him very heavily in his advice. And so thank you for all your help and your responsiveness, because you've always been very responsive. We get questions quite a bit about whether it be virtual or in person, giving trainings to councils, commissioners, and other county officials especially, but this also applies in a municipal setting at times as well, about a myriad of items that the DLGF oversees, abatements or utilities that may be closing down and those kinds of things. Is it a violation of the public access laws or the open door laws for us to present to all of the members of a council or commissioners and it not be a public meeting?
There is an exception. There are about 8 different exceptions to the definition of a meeting. One of them would be traveling to and attending trainings or orientations by organizations that are devoted to the betterment of government. I would argue DLGF is exactly that. If I go to commissioners association meetings where you might have all 3 commissioners there at once. It's no problem. It's a training. It's an orientation. It doesn't have to do with specific public business. It's much more general. So that's perfectly fine. They don't have to post notice of that. It's not open to the public necessarily. What gets when it becomes problematic is when they start talking about specific solutions to specific problems that are pending before those boards. But general trainings, fine.
Thank you.
Question about.
I was just going to comment on the potential for First Amendment auditors to make money off of their videos. If anyone's running into that, especially with like a repeat offender, one quick way to ruin that for them would be to pull up a Disney song on YouTube and you play that really loudly, and Disney will sue their pants off and make sure those videos get yanked down. They are the most litigious organization in the world.
I've heard this as a strategy. I don't know if it's the best strategy, but I've heard it. Yeah.
Hi there. Have you ever run into a county attorney telling anybody that they have to file forms with the state to go through the process of getting approved to attend an executive session? And if so, how would you handle that situation?
I've never encountered that. The statute itself says that anyone who could further the discussion, whether it be from the public or anywhere else, can be invited into the executive session. And I'm not familiar with any kind of form or registration or anything like that. I would suggest that isn't the case. That anyone the board wants there, other than a bargaining adversary, if they're like talking about a real estate transaction or something like that, then anyone else could be in the room if they have a vested interest in being there. No registration required. I haven't heard that though. I'd be interested to talk to that county attorney.
Oh. And so how would you advise having that conversation with the county attorney?
Have them reach out to me.
Okay.
Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you so much for your questions and your attention. And please let me know if there's anything I can do for you. I will be happy to do so. And enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you.